Dexter Morgan got away with killing for years inside a police department, using their own equipment, their own database access, and their own trust in him as a forensic analyst. It sounds impossible, and honestly, it should be. Real serial killer cases, the ones investigators have actually studied for decades, are full of patterns that would have exposed Dexter almost immediately. Not because real detectives are smarter than the writers of this show, but because Dexter makes almost every mistake real serial killers have made before him, the exact mistakes that got those real offenders caught. Today we're walking through how the lessons learned from actual cases like BTK, the Green River Killer, and others would have ended Dexter's career in days, not seasons. Quick thing before we dig into this, if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe and tap that like button, because we break down cases exactly like this every single week. Let's start with the most basic vulnerability in Dexter's entire operation, which is that he works inside the same department investigating the murders he commits. This sounds like an advantage on the show, and for a while it functions like one, giving him access to evidence, crime scene details, and inside information nobody else gets. But real criminology research on offenders who insert themselves into investigations tells a completely different story. This pattern, an offender embedding themselves close to the investigation of their own crimes, is one of the most well-documented red flags in behavioral analysis. The BTK killer, Dennis Rader, actually worked adjacent to law enforcement himself for years, and investigators eventually built profiles specifically looking for someone with exactly that kind of access and insight into police procedure. The moment Miami Metro started using modern behavioral profiling the way real departments do today, instead of just treating Dexter's victims as isolated cases, his position inside the department would have become the first thing flagged, not the perfect cover it appears to be on screen. Now let's talk about victimology, because this is where real investigators would have dismantled Dexter's pattern almost instantly. Every single person Dexter kills fits an extremely specific profile. Someone he's identified as guilty of a serious crime that the legal system failed to punish. Real behavioral analysts build profiles by studying exactly this kind of pattern, what type of victim an offender selects, and why. When you have a string of killings where every victim has a documented criminal history involving violent crime, that's not a coincidence detectives miss. That's a screaming signal that points directly toward an offender with intimate knowledge of those criminal records. In the real world, criminal histories are accessed through specific databases that log every single search. If multiple murder victims all happen to have been searched in the same database around the same time period before they died, that overlap becomes one of the very first things a competent digital forensics team checks. And Dexter, working inside the department with direct access to those exact systems, would show up in that search log every single time. This actually mirrors a real investigative technique used to catch insider threats in law enforcement and corporate environments alike, looking at who accessed sensitive records right before something suspicious happened to the person those records were about. It doesn't take a genius detective to run that cross-reference. It takes someone pulling basic system logs, which most departments do as a matter of routine oversight, especially after any case involving missing or murdered individuals with criminal records. Dexter's victims being criminals isn't his clever cover. It's the exact pattern that makes him traceable, because it means every victim connects back to a specific, searchable database that he personally has access to and personally uses before almost every kill. There's also the matter of how Dexter actually disposes of his victims, and this is where real forensic science completely dismantles his methods. He wraps bodies in plastic, dismembers them, and dumps the remains at sea in Florida Bay, repeating this exact method over years across an enormous number of victims. Real serial offenders who reuse a consistent method and disposal site eventually get caught specifically because of that consistency. Investigators studying the Green River Killer case spent years connecting victims, partly through the consistent pattern of where and how bodies were disposed. And once law enforcement started treating disappearances in a specific geographic cluster as connected rather than isolated, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Dexter, using the exact same bags, the exact same wrapping technique, and the exact same general disposal zone repeatedly, is precisely the kind of signature modern forensic teams are trained to identify across multiple cases. Real marine recovery units and Coast Guard patrols regularly find debris and remains in coastal waters, and a consistent pattern of wrapped remains appearing in a specific bay over years would eventually generate exactly the kind of cross-case analysis that connects scattered disappearances into one unified investigation. This pattern recognition gets even more dangerous for Dexter once you factor in trace evidence. Real forensic science has advanced specifically around recovering DNA and fiber evidence from submerged remains, even after extended periods underwater. Plastic wrapping, while it slows decomposition and complicates recovery, doesn't erase trace evidence the way Dexter's success on the show implies. Modern forensic labs can recover fingerprints from plastic surfaces, identify tool marks from the exact blade used in dismemberment, and match adhesive or wrapping material back to specific manufacturers and even specific retail purchases. Dexter buying the same brand of plastic sheeting repeatedly from local hardware stores creates exactly the kind of traceable purchase pattern that real investigators use to connect physical evidence back to a specific person, especially once cross-referenced against database access logs that already point towards someone inside the department. Let's move to Dexter's actual kill room setup, because this is one of the most exposed parts of his entire process if you apply real-world investigative standards. He stages an elaborate space with plastic sheeting, restraints, and specific tools, used repeatedly across different locations. Real serial offenders who maintain a consistent ritual or staging method are some of the easiest to eventually profile, because that ritual becomes a signature investigators search for once they suspect a pattern. The moment any of Dexter's victims is found with evidence of restraint marks consistent with a specific binding method, repeated across multiple cases, that becomes the kind of behavioral signature the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit specifically trains agents to identify and connect across jurisdictions. Real cases involving ritualistic staging, like those studied in classic serial offender research from the Bureau, show that this kind of consistency, while it might feel safe and controlled to the offender, is actually one of the most identifiable fingerprints an investigator can ask for. Now here's where Dexter's job becomes an even bigger liability instead of an advantage. Blood spatter analysis is his actual profession, which means he has an unusually sophisticated understanding of how to avoid leaving traceable blood evidence at his own crime scenes. But real forensic labs don't only look for blood spatter. They look for luminol reactive residue that can reveal blood cleaned up months or years earlier. They look for backspatter on clothing and tools that even careful offenders miss. And they look for inconsistencies between an analyst's documented findings and what additional independent testing later reveals. If Dexter is the one analyzing blood evidence at crime scenes connected to his own victims, any competent oversight process eventually catches discrepancies between his conclusions and what a second, independent forensic review finds. Real departments increasingly use double-blind verification, specifically because internal bias, intentional or not, has been documented as a real problem in forensic labs. An analyst quietly steering conclusions away from himself across multiple cases is exactly the kind of internal inconsistency that audits and case reviews are designed to catch. This is also where Dexter's personal relationships become a massive vulnerability, because real investigations don't just look at evidence in isolation. They look at who had access, who had motive, and who had opportunity across every connected case. Dexter's sister works in the same department and eventually becomes a lead investigator on cases connected to his victims. Real departments have conflict of interest protocols specifically because family members working adjacent to cases involving people they're close to creates an unavoidable risk of compromised objectivity, or in a case like this, unintentional access to information that helps the actual offender. Once Deborah starts working homicide cases that overlap with her brother's victims, any standard departmental review process examining her caseload alongside her family connections would have flagged exactly the kind of proximity Dexter exploits throughout the show. Let's talk about digital evidence too, Because Dexter operates in an era where almost everyone leaves a digital trail, and his victims are no exception. Real investigators reconstruct a victim's final days using phone records, location data, and any communication leading up to their disappearance. If multiple victims who disappear over the years show overlapping contact with the same phone number, or location pings that place them near the same person shortly before they vanish, that overlap becomes exactly the kind of connection digital forensics teams are specifically trained to find. Dexter occasionally contacting or surveilling victims before killing them, even briefly, creates exactly the kind of digital footprint that modern investigators can pull through basic cell tower record requests. The same investigative technique used to crack open countless real serial offender cases once cell phone data became standard evidence in homicide investigations. There's also a behavioral pattern worth examining here, because real serial offenders who maintain an outward public persona of normalcy, even respectability, almost always show small inconsistencies in their behavior that close associates eventually notice, even if they don't immediately understand what they're seeing. Dexter's coworkers and family repeatedly notice strange absences, unexplained injuries, and behavior that doesn't quite add up, and on the show, these moments get explained away through clever lies or simply written off because everyone trusts him. In real investigations, especially ones involving a person with this much institutional access, those small inconsistencies tend to accumulate into something investigators eventually act on, especially once any kind of formal internal review gets triggered by even one unresolved case connected to him. Let's also look at the boat itself, because Dexter's choice to dispose of bodies at sea using his own vessel is one of the more glaring vulnerabilities once you apply real-world maritime and financial tracking to it. Boats require registration, fuel purchases, and maintenance records, all of which create a paper trail. Real investigators studying disappearances connected to a coastal area routinely pull marina logs, fuel dock receipts, and harbor security footage when trying to establish movement patterns around the time someone goes missing. If Dexter's boat shows a consistent pattern of late-night departures, coinciding with the approximate time frame several victims were last seen, that's exactly the kind of correlation a digital forensics unit specializing in financial and movement records would flag within days of pulling marina activity logs. Real cases involving offenders who used boats or vehicles to dispose of remains, including several documented in coastal Florida itself, have been cracked open specifically through this kind of mundane paper trail, fuel receipts, toll records, and harbor check-ins that nobody thinks to hide because they don't seem like evidence until someone starts connecting dates. This actually connects to a broader vulnerability around how methodical, ritualistic killers tend to get caught once authorities start applying geographic and temporal correlation to their movements. Israel Keyes, one of the most carefully prepared real serial offenders ever investigated, went to extraordinary lengths to avoid leaving a trackable pattern, using cash, avoiding cell phones during his crimes, and traveling far from his home base specifically to prevent investigators from connecting his movements to disappearances. Even with all of that precaution, he was eventually identified after a single piece of footage from a gas station surveillance camera placed his vehicle near a victim's last known location. Dexter, by contrast, operates almost entirely within a small geographic radius around his own home and workplace, using his own boat, his own car, and his own routine locations repeatedly. Compared to an offender who went to Keyes-level lengths and still got caught through one piece of footage, Dexter's far more localized, repetitive pattern would be almost trivially easy to map using nothing more than standard traffic camera and toll booth records that already exist in any modern American city. There's also the question of how Dexter's personal relationships create exposure that real investigators specifically trained to exploit. Throughout the show, multiple people who get close to Dexter eventually start noticing things that don't add up. Strange absences, unexplained injuries, evasive answers about where he's been. Real investigators interviewing the inner circle of a suspected offender are specifically trained to look for exactly this kind of second-hand inconsistency. Not a smoking gun confession, but small contradictions between what different people remember about the suspect's whereabouts and behavior during specific windows of time. Once any single victim connects, even loosely, to Dexter through database access or geographic proximity, a competent investigation doesn't stop at him. It interviews his coworkers, his sister, his former partners, and any inconsistency in their accounts of his behavior during the relevant timeframes becomes another thread connecting back to him. The same way real task forces gradually built cases against offenders by accumulating dozens of small, individually inconclusive details from people in the suspect's orbit. It's also worth considering how Dexter's own psychological profile would read to a real behavioral analyst studying the broader pattern of his victims and methods. He targets people who have escaped legal consequences for violent crimes, which on the surface might look like vigilante justice. But to a trained profiler, this kind of victim selection actually narrows the suspect pool dramatically rather than widening it. It suggests an offender with direct, detailed access to case outcomes and criminal histories that aren't always public knowledge. Someone embedded in or adjacent to the justice system itself. Real behavioral analysis specifically looks at what victim selection reveals about an offender's likely occupation, knowledge base, and access. And Dexter's pattern points almost directly at law enforcement, legal, or forensic professions. The exact kind of profile that would have investigators looking inward at their own department rather than outward at a stranger, especially once 2 or 3 cases with this same victim profile pile up in the same jurisdiction. And this is really the through line across every single vulnerability we've covered, because none of these gaps exist in isolation. The database access logs, the consistent disposal pattern, the boat and vehicle movement records, the inconsistencies his own associates notice, and the victim profile pointing towards someone inside the system. All of these threads point in the exact same direction at the exact same time. Real investigations rarely solve cases through one single piece of brilliant deduction. They solve them by accumulating multiple independent threads that all happen to converge on the same person. And Dexter generates an enormous number of those threads simply by operating the way he does, repeatedly, for years, inside an institution specifically built to notice exactly this kind of pattern. You have an analyst with documented access to criminal background databases right before a string of victims with matching criminal histories disappear. You have consistent disposal methods generating recoverable trace evidence across multiple recovered remains. You have a sister working homicide cases with an unreported conflict of interest. You have inconsistencies in his own forensic conclusions that a routine double-blind audit would eventually catch. And you have a digital trail connecting him to victims before their disappearance that basic cell tower data could expose within days of a formal request. None of this requires brilliant deduction or a lucky break. It requires the kind of standard procedural diligence real departments use, specifically because cases like BTK, the Green River Killer, and dozens of other real serial offenders proved exactly how dangerous it is to assume an insider couldn't possibly be the person investigators are looking for. This is really the central irony of Dexter's entire premise. The show works because it asks you to believe a brilliant forensic analyst could exploit blind spots in an investigation indefinitely. Real cases studied by behavioral analysts for decades suggest almost the opposite, that the very access and knowledge Dexter uses to stay hidden are exactly the kind of variables modern investigative procedure is specifically designed to flag. Real serial killers who evaded capture for years, the ones whose cases actually shaped how departments build profiles today, were eventually caught because investigators learned to stop assuming insiders were above suspicion and started applying the same scrutiny to everyone with access, motive, and opportunity, regardless of badge or title. So if you ever found yourself wondering how a real department could possibly miss someone like Dexter operating right under their noses for years, the uncomfortable answer is that a real, modern department using the lessons learned from actual serial killer investigations almost certainly wouldn't. The patterns are too consistent, the access too traceable, and the oversight procedures built specifically in response to real cases like his would have turned what feels like an unstoppable killer on television into a closed case within a matter of days. It's worth ending on this thought. because it actually says something about why Dexter works so well as fiction in the first place. The show isn't really asking you to believe real investigative procedure is sloppy or naive. It's asking you to root for someone operating inside a system the writers deliberately simplify, stripping away the database audits, the marina logs, the conflict of interest reviews, and the cross-reference victimology that real departments rely on every single day. Once you put all of those real-world safeguards back into the picture, the show's entire premise depends on every single one of them failing to catch a pattern this consistent, this localized, and this deeply tied to one person's institutional access, which is exactly the scenario modern forensic procedure was built to prevent. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure you're subscribed and tap that like button before you head out, because we've got plenty more of these real-world breakdowns coming, and you really don't want to miss the next one.